Okay, this video conference is made possible with support primarily from the Robert Schalkenbach Foundation, also the Foundation for Economic Justice, the Henry George Institute, Common Ground USA, Earth Sharing Associates, and private donors. And the topic is immigration then and now. I have some thoughts about Chinese immigration, which Henry George was criticized for opposing. And Steve Sklar is here. Steve has for 26 years been an immigration attorney. And you either, I guess if you're an immigration attorney, you either work for the government or you work for the applicants to immigrate. And Steve works for the applicants to immigrate. And knows a lot more about immigration now, and probably knows more about immigration back then too. But I'll turn it over to you, Steve, if you have anything you want to say at the beginning, or.
Sure, I'll kick us off.
Kick me off.
Okay, no.
What kind of an immigration attorney just kicks people off?
Well, you know, lawyers rightly have the reputation for being argumentative, so I'll be actually working against that somewhat today. But no, I'm not kicking you off. I meant in the football, also known as soccer sense of the word.
Oh.
Yeah. Okay. I'm trying to get gallery view somehow, but that's not happening. All right. Okay, I'm just like a thumbnail.
Oh, I have to stop screen sharing. That'll.
Okay, I'm a mere thumbnail on the body of history, but we'll try to counteract that as well. All right, so I'll start here on history, which I know more about as of a couple of months ago when I started to do talks somewhat like this than I used to know. So the U.S. basically has kind of almost written into its DNA a sort of ambivalent attitude towards immigration going back to at least the beginning of the existence of the country. So, you know, on the one hand, we have the welcoming attitude and often regard ourselves as a national identity, as a nation of immigrants, and we're proud of that. Almost the character identity of the Statue of Liberty is kind of bestowed on it by the words of Emma Lazarus that are on the plaque at the base, and they, you know, kind of express this, you know, one of our two kind of attitudes, which is the welcoming, all in favor of immigration. Just, you know, those lines. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. The wretched refuse of your teeming shore, send these the homeless tempest tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. So that's, you know, and for the first 60 years or so of the existence of the US, that was really the dominant view officially and popularly. We wanted people. We wanted people to come in. We invited immigration. But really, even starting back then, I'll read you a quick thing to take us through the rest of this introduction. From somebody from 1751 who said, who he kind of started expressing the other side of the view. Why should so this person was talking about German immigration in Pennsylvania. He wrote, why should the Palatine Boers be suffered to swarm into our settlements and by herding together establish their language and manners to the exclusion of ours? Why should Pennsylvania, founded by the English, become a colony of aliens who will shortly be so numerous as to Germanize us instead of us Anglifying them, and will never adopt our language or customs any more than they can acquire our complexion? So the author was Ben Franklin, signer of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. I discovered this in a book, Guarding the Golden Door by Roger Daniels. And he has comments, that kind of summarizes a lot of the sort of not so welcoming view that's carried right on through the history of the country. He says, Franklin's comments are typical of American complaints against immigrants, irrespective of time and place. They have bad habits, Palatine bores. They are clannish, herding together. They don't speak English, their language, and they are going to take over, Germanize us instead of our Anglifying them. These are the arguments, Daniels writes, used against Italians, Jews, and others 100 years ago, and may be heard today against Mexicans, Latinos, Hispanics, etc. The targets have changed, but the complaints remain largely the same. Their gravamen is simply this: they are not like us. I should note that Franklin kind of eased up, at least as far as European immigration, later in his life. Earlier on, he felt that basically, Southern Europeans, Spaniards, Italians, basically not white enough. But he changed his view maybe when he became an ambassador to Europe. So, you see that side of things, and I experience it in practicing immigration law, kind of skitsy, kind of ambivalent. So we have these various programs that allow people to come live and work here, various ways that you have to qualify to get that permission. And but even when the programs exist, and my day job is to marshal people through them, there's all kinds of ambivalence sort of written into that. For my sins, I have a subspecialty in something called H-2B visas, which are seasonal, technically non-agricultural visas. They're used a lot by landscapers. I guess the landscape is not considered to be agricultural. Hotel industry is seasonal, has peaks in a need for a workforce. And I have a sub-niche in soccer coaching, youth soccer coaches. And, so the sort of ambivalence there, or the sort of hostility, even though we have this program, is something I face in a sort of nerdy, mundane, kind of annoying way. First of all, the H-2B program, you have to jump through so many hoops that even immigration lawyers most of us are smart enough to stay away from this area, because there's so many opportunities for failure, even if you do things perfectly or near perfectly. I've had a one-letter typo that would be meaningless in any other area of law, would cost me $2,000 and having to re-advertise extremely long newspaper ads, because you have to invite U.S. workers to apply. Even though I've been doing these for 14 years, we get little to no, with an emphasis on no, U.S. response. Apparently U.S.
So this is where you have to prove that a worker is indispensable, that a foreign worker is indispensable.
No, you have to
can't
prove
find American workers.
that you can't. That you have to advertise the job to the U.S. workforce. And in these areas, the reason that the visas are approved is that there really is not a U.S. workforce available to fill most or all of the spots. People don't really want to do that work. Go figure. You would think.
I used to volunteer at a radio station, one like WBAI. It was in Pittsburgh, WYEP, but it was like an all-volunteer radio station. And the one fellow there was from England, and did a show on British music. And somebody wanted to hire him to do that show professionally. And so he had to get a work permit to do that because he was a non-citizen. And so they wrote the job description required that the person must have a genuine British accent.
So interestingly enough, that kind of thing usually doesn't fly. I mean, that will normally get you shot down and your application will fail, because the Department of Labor, which gets involved in those, is on the lookout for filters that are unreasonable, and a flag goes up for them, and maybe rightly so, when you require either foreign language requirement,
I don't know if they succeeded.
Yeah, I mean, people luck through, but by and large, that's going to be tough. But the last thing I'll say on this is that so some years ago, every couple of years, just to make my life more miserable, the government changes regulations in the H-2B area, and at a certain point, they reduced a certain interim online advertising requirement from 30 days to 10 days, which was really helpful because there's always quota pressures too. You could do everything perfectly and the application fails because there's only 60,000 spots available every year, and certain times of year the spots are used up. So that 30 days down to 10 days was important because of the timing of everything. And at one point I was talking to the New Jersey Department of Labor, which got involved, and there was a woman named Gail there. I said, but the regulations have changed. You should only be listing this for 10 days. That extra 20 days, you're going to probably knock us out for quotas. Why are you doing this? And she said, well, we were talking about it here, and we don't want these people getting these jobs. And I had like two reactions. One was, and I said, that's not your place to like do backdoor legislation. I mean, you can't just, and the other, and I think I said also to her, I was very grateful to her because of her candor. It was like, I thought that's what you guys were thinking, and it's refreshing to just hear it. So there, even where we have programs that on the one hand say certain people can come, on the other hand, often, especially lately, there are a million ways to kill a program. The death by 1,000 cuts is one way to look at it. So, we have that, and we've had, all kinds of layers of different types of barriers to immigration that fluctuate. That's another thing people are not aware of, that our immigration laws are very variable over time. So when people say, I just want people to follow the law, what always gets lost in the discussion on every level is that what the law is a creature of policy and is changeable. So that was my kickoff, and you'll notice it went on for a bit. I'm sorry, Dan.
That's all right.
But you did ask. Your turn.
Yeah, I wanted to look at the history of immigration, and I also wanted to tie it to Georgist principles. There are two boundaries that you cannot cross without permission. One is the national border, and the other is the property line. And Georgism deals with the property line. It says that you're paying land value tax not to use property, but to exclude other people from using it. The whole point of land value tax is that it's not that you're using the land. You pay the same tax whether you're using the land or not. You pay the tax because you're excluding others from using the land. And that principle, as a moral principle, I mean, I don't know of a legal mechanism to make that work, especially because there isn't much of an international law. But the moral question is, if you are excluding people from your nation, then do you have an obligation to share the rent beyond your borders somehow? And I don't have any sense of how you could intelligently do that. Mostly because the people most interested in coming here are the ones that live in the most oppressive countries. And if you send the money to those countries, it will not go to those people. If they had a share of their own country's land, of their own country's rent, they would probably be happy to stay there. So it ends up being a bit of a knotty problem, but the principle is the same, that you don't have a right to exclude people without some kind of compensatory without compensation. And I'm looking at the history of immigration, and I've been looking at the gradual transition from the Constitution to the Civil War. And prior to the Civil War, immigration was a state purview. And it was used very much to keep free blacks were not allowed to spend more than 14 days in Connecticut. They were not allowed in Ohio and Indiana. So many of the northern states, far from being anti-slavery because they were less racist, they were just as racist. They just didn't want slavery competing with free workers. It was not so much for the benefit of the slaves. And if you want to dig deeper into this, there was an abolitionist movement and a anti-slavery movement. And the abolitionists were disliked by everybody, but the abolitionists were the ones who were genuinely preoccupied with the humanity of the slaves. And the anti-slavery movement was preoccupied with whether the political power of the slave states would supersede the political power of the Northeast industrial states. And so it's an interesting, there's a lot of interesting complex political dynamics there that we have kind of glossed over.
Yeah, we kind of think of it as more binary, abolition or, you know, pro-slavery. So it is interesting that there was this, there was more to the politics of it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, mostly what I've been reading up on is after the period that you're talking about, from kind of
well, 1868 is apparently when the federal government, and I think it was through a court ruling, and it was, you know, it was the Reconstruction. It was the Republicans controlled everything from the courts to the legislatures to the state governments, and during that period, immigration became a federal function rather than a state function.
Right. Yeah. So maybe because I live in modern immigration law, I have tended to look at federal policy. But another thing that comes out at me about the history is that on immigration is that sort of taking the cue from that quote about Ben Franklin. There have been waves of different groups, as everybody probably knows, that have taken their time in the persecution sort of barrel. I'm sure we'll talk more about Chinese immigration, particularly on the West Coast. But so there was the Chinese Exclusion Acts. Again, we'll talk about that. But there was the Japanese, there was anti-Japanese hostility around 1900. All up and down the West Coast, Japanese shopkeepers were attacked in shops. Filipinos came in for persecution at a certain point, even though the Philippines were a U.S. possession for a while, till we said, all right, you're on your own. But Filipinos were persecuted for a while. There was a group called the Order of the Star-Spangled Banner that felt that America was for white, not just whites, but Protestant whites. So there was an anti-Catholic movement for a while. I think it was around the turn of the century, where churches were burned and convents were burned. The Irish have had their share of kind of persecution and on and on. You know, Italians, Jews. You know, almost every wave gets their turn. So
and the Irish were the Irish, once they were kind of dominant here, became anti-immigrant toward the Eastern Europeans.
Well, I have to say that the readiness of even recent immigrants to kind of turn around and kind of hate the later comers is something that I've noticed on a individual level with some of my even clients. I mean, I had a client, a nice enough guy. We worked well together. He was an American citizen of Greek ancestry, but he very Americanized. Probably born and raised in the U.S., married a former model from Czechoslovakia, and we were chatting at a certain point, and he said, "You know, I just thought I'm against, you know, illegal immigration. I just want people to come here like legally, these people from Mexico. And I said to him, Louis, your wife was here illegally, she came with a tourist visa, but then she overstayed. So she was here. Mm-hmm. And I had a conversation with a guy I played soccer with a little, who was an immigrant himself, and making the same point. And a bunch of us were standing around, some people from the Caribbean, and me and him. And I said to him, he was from Russia originally. I said, what was your history? He came on a student visa. Did you ever work here illegally? Did you violate that? Yeah. So people forget not only the previous generation, but it's even, they could be here, just off the boat, so to speak. And it's like, I'm here, but I don't want those people to come here. So it's
they pull up the gangplank.
Sometimes just when they're right off it.
Well, and they, immigrants come here and obviously when they first get here, they are almost always landless. Unless they were very rich and sent agents out ahead of time to buy them some real estate. But, 99 point some digits after that are going to arrive here and be without land. And it's those without land who are forced into competition with others without land. So the land question ties very much to this. We were very open to immigration when the land was very underpopulated compared to Europe. And the landlords certainly wanted more tenants, but the tenants didn't particularly mind. And a lot of immigration was somebody would come here and earn enough money to send for relatives, and there was an internal, fun, each person who gets here uses his earnings to bring other people from his family here.
Yeah, that was the case for my family, and I'm guessing also for my wife's family. My ancestors are Jews from Eastern Europe, sort of the border of Ukraine and Poland. We're never quite sure which, because it was a very flexible border.
Understanding is Italians did that a good bit too. I don't know that the Irish did very much, because the Irish, basically the British sent them here.
Right. That essay by George you're thinking of, with the wonderful title "Dumping Garbage."
Yeah.
Brilliant essay. I mean, obviously he uses that term with complete sympathy for the Irish. I mean, his point is nobody's garbage, but I guess that's true. One thing so mulling over stuff for this talk, I'm trying to think of this sort of through a Georgist lens. I asked myself, what are the roots of what you could call restrictionism or xenophobia, or sometimes called nativism. And on the economic side, it seems to me, and I think George, was kind of clear in his head about this, it's essentially, and the phrase that one hears from everybody is they're taking our jobs. At bottom, it's basically the wages fund theory. It's a feeling that the ultimate source of wages is a fixed fund of capital set aside for their payment, and therefore anybody coming into the labor pool will reduce the average amount of wages available to laborers. So, and that's kind of implicit in a lot of economic-based dislike and policy arguments against immigration. And what I found interesting, sort of tiptoeing or stumbling us towards the Chinese question, is that article that George published at the start of his kind of public writing life in the New York Tribune in 1869, where he basically espouses that, as far as economics goes, that view that that particularly it's cheap labor, that in competition with workmen, but later in his life, once he has, like a year later, his central insight about the role of land monopoly in economy. And even from in Progress and Poverty, and right on through, as far as the economics of it go, he's pretty clear that he was wrong. And much later in 1893, he writes a letter to William Lloyd Garrison Jr., one of his sort of admirers and a fellow single taxer, that he was wrong. He said that article was crude because I hadn't clearly worked out economics, and I looked into John Stuart Mill, and I basically accepted the wages fund theory, which Mill espoused unquestioningly. But the first thing he does in Progress and Poverty, his major work, is he book 1, chapter 1, he starts attacking, and he basically debunked the wages fund theory. And on page 2 of chapter 1, he says, he mentions foreign labor as an example of a kind of fear related to the wages fund theory, which he dismantles. So it's interesting because his first position on at least the economics of immigration, to a large extent, he ends up kind of reversing himself on for the rest of his writing career.
A lot of it is like, when he debunked Malthus, he basically said, well, it's not that it's false, that you've ascribed the wrong reason. And so
right, it's not fundamental enough.
Yeah, the wages fund reason was wrong. The conclusion that you will drive down wages is not wrong, but you drive down wages because you drive up rent. And so
right, and he also points out, if you shut down immigration 100%, as our current administration kind of would like to do, maybe, you're still going to have the problem. You're going to have the domestic competition.
You might slow down the transition from wages getting the big share to rent getting the big share, but you won't stop it.
Yeah. So, but we'll get to Chinese, because it's waiting for us, Dan. It's waiting. I think it'll get live. But will you permit me to read something that I dug out? I did a little archival research in the Henry George collection in New York. And I discovered, some of his sort of typed up notes for articles for the Standard, his Georgist newspaper. And I basically, and I've read some of the Standard articles. I've dug them out with Wynne Ackenbaum's help. But an interesting thing on this very point, that'll sort of be a good segue to getting to sort of the other area of anti-immigration sort of policy. But where he kind of makes the same point that we're just talking about. This is May 12th, 1888. And I believe this ended up in the Standard, and it's entitled Immigration. So he says, W.J. Allen, writing from Brooklyn, wants to know whether I am in favor of restricting immigration. As to Mongolians, basically Chinese, or any other races that cannot readily assimilate with our people, my answer is yes. Yes, I'm in favor of restricting immigration. As to European people, no. Under present conditions, at least, there are grave reasons for refusing to admit immigrants who perpetuating marked distinctions which would constitute them an insoluble element in our population, would give rise to difficulties and dangers such as are threatened by the Chinese question in the Pacific states and by the race question in the South. But these reasons for exclusion do not apply for European immigrants, even when of different tongues from our own. Unless isolated in separate communities, these immigrants quickly learn our language and adopt our customs, and their children at least become indistinguishable from the rest of our population. And here's, as to wages fund, the last bit. There is room enough here for all who are coming or are likely to come to us from Europe. And if our unused natural opportunities were only open to those willing to use them, these immigrants would not only be able to find employment without displacing anyone already here, for the same reason that two men working together can produce more than twice as much as one man, their addition to our population ought to render it possible for us all to get a better living. If it seems that there are too many people already here, If it seems that newcomers must swell the ranks of those who cannot find employment and increase the intensity of that competition of mere laborer with mere laborer, which in all occupations produces its effect on those already here and would continue to affect them if immigration were to cease, in our giving to some men the absolute ownership and control of the natural element on which and from which all must live, the restriction of immigration would do nothing to right this fundamental wrong. Its agitation would have but the effect, and in large part this is the conscious intention of those who advocate it, of diverting the popular mind from the only path by which the emancipation of labor can be reached. So, you know, as an immigration lawyer, putting aside the European-Chinese distinction, which we'll get into, I obviously love this. I mean, you know, and as a, you know, so I've been an immigration lawyer for 26 years. I've been reading George, not every day, but, you know, I was introduced to him 48 years ago. I worked it out. So this is, you know, with that one thing that we'll talk about, that's great for me. You know, I'm like, right on. Yeah, but there, okay, so segue. There are another basis, as I look at it, for anti-immigrant sort of sentiment, and that I would call sort of identity-based. In reading up on George and looking into this, he does use the term non-assimilable. You know, the assimilation is a big issue for him. That is, you know, conceptually, it's a different issue from wages fund and economics, and there I sort of, I kind of stumble onto things. It's a part of a fun thing, a little bit of archival research I've ever done. You kind of find things that you weren't looking for, and so I was aware of some of this stuff from having read George's son's biography of him, but I became more aware, and then I reread, you know, all of the 1869 New York Tribune article, and it gets pretty brutal, pretty vicious. I could read quotes from it, but you know, it seems to me that it's a different ground, and I think George, to the end of his days, believed that, and he's felt the same way about Black people, about people from Africa, even though he was, I think, an abolitionist. He was certainly anti-slavery, probably, you know, fiercely. But, you know, he felt, if you want to be sort of diplomatic about it, he felt like the problem with Chinese immigration, or a serious problem, is that because of differences of customs and religion, and appearance and physical characteristics, which, you know, he uses the word race, they can't assimilate, and so he has a deep problem with that, and in an interesting way also with Black people, but not as vehemently, because I guess there might, see, you know, a lot of this, I think, comes down to familiarity with people, and I think he was aware from the history of the country to his day that, I mean, there were a lot of Black people who were shanghaied into the U.S. as slaves. So he sees, I think, that they're, you know, starting to, maybe they are able to assimilate, although he
was in
there.
Yeah, he was in California till 1880, so.
Mm-hmm.
So he would be much more aware of the Chinese question than he would of, you know, his firsthand knowledge of former slaves and stuff would be not nearly as intense as his firsthand knowledge of Chinese immigration.
Yeah.
I wanted to
go ahead.
I wanted to divide this into three categories, which are assimilating, isolating, and hostile. So
what was the last one? Hostile?
Hostile. So like the immigration issues with Mexicans are pretty much economic, in that Mexicans, everybody tends to do that. I mean, in Pittsburgh, there are Irish neighborhoods and Greek neighborhoods and Italian neighborhoods, and they have, you know, the Italians got here a long, long time ago, and there's still a section of Pittsburgh called Little Italy. There's integration is not the natural state of man any more than segregation is. That you know, freedom to integrate or not integrate is the value. But I always said, you know, we got rid of forced segregation, but we couldn't leave it alone, and we decided we had to forced integration. And then underlying that was this notion that the reason separate but equal, you know, the original reason separate but equal was impossible was that it wasn't equal. It was originally, it was a joke that these things were separate but equal, that the black schools were being grossly underfunded by white-controlled school boards. And somehow that got supplanted with this kind of elitist notion that what black kids need is to rub elbows with white kids, you know, that being around white kids will somehow make black kids smarter. And that's, to me, that's like totally missing the point of why we had to get rid of segregation. In Pittsburgh, the best, by far, the best elementary school was in what was called Sugar Top. It was the middle class black neighborhood, and because it was middle class, and that's where all the black judges and city council members and, you know, there were a lot of doctors and stuff. They totally dominated that school as, you know, a parents association. And it was so good that the few white kids were there went there because their parents recognized that it was a superior school. It was 98% black, and it was by far the best school in Pittsburgh, the best elementary school in Pittsburgh. So the racial superiority inferiority thing is not really the issue, but there are cultural issues. I mean, obviously, our concern about Muslim immigrants has to do with terrorism, and our concern about Mexican immigrants has to do with drug cartels and stuff. And
no, but
we could solve that by legalizing, you know, or decriminalizing.
Well, I would argue, like on the side of Muslim immigration, that a lot of our concerns, you know, health and safety and terrorism, you know, security concerns, are also colored by often a racial or racist agenda. Here's what I mean. You know, the amount of domestic white terrorism, even since 9/11, I think, you know, it's an endemic problem, and it can't be pinned on Muslims or any foreigners. But there can be a readiness to impose policy sort of negatively on the other that can be driven by, you know, we do. I mean, I think we still have, and we certainly did in the late 1800s and early 1900s, this maybe not dominant view, but it was an influential view of racial superiority. I'm thinking I read, here's another archival mistake that I made, a stumble. I meant to read a book that my mother had mentioned to me on called Guarding the Guarded Gate by Daniel Ockrent. And it's on the eugenics movement and how that affected immigration policy in the 1920s, 30s, 40s. But by mistake, I ended up with Roger Daniels' book, Guarding the Golden Door, and that's how I stumbled on the quote from Franklin. So stumbling is just a pleasure when you're doing research. But in any case, I read, to my fascination and horror, about the eugenics movement, where it really was, and also sometimes known as scientific racism, where the view is that white people are superior to any non-white people biologically, genetically, mentally, and so the thing to do is to have breeding programs to encourage the improvement of the human race, just as we would without agriculture and animal breeding, and also to prevent the degradation of the human race by the influx of interbreeding with other races. So I mean, it's basically discredited.
Well, I think race
but it
makes it
influenced
easy.
immigration policy, is what I'm saying at the time. I mean, Theodore Roosevelt kind of subscribed to some of this, and there were some leading citizens. Senator Henry Cabot Lodge was big on this, and so it had its influence even in immigration policy, to where certain public charge and certain literacy requirements were really kind of pretexts for a kind of national, ethnic, racial bias, which weren't really technically done away with until the 1960s under Lyndon Johnson. So, I mean, I don't know. I think we have had a serious problem. Though, I mean, the country's not monolithic. So this was a group, but there've been these things, and they continue today with white supremacy. So.
Well, I don't want to overstate the race aspect, because we had this problem with Germans in the 1880s and 1890s.
Right.
That the Haymarket anarchists were German and were teaching people how to throw bombs. I used to believe, because I grew up in the left, and they told me the Haymarket anarchists were framed. Well, the Haymarket transcripts are online. The Chicago History Project has the Haymarket complete transcripts. They are so complete that anything that was stricken from the record is in there and marked stricken from the record. So, and as I'm looking at that, I'm looking at, if you just search on the word dynamite, you'll get lots of really compelling arguments that they were here basically to make trouble. And there was a major rash of bombings and assassination attempts from the 1880s up till like early 1920, 21. And most of them were German immigrants. And so Louis Post, who was, he was the top Georgist after Henry George died, he was put in charge of deportation. And he was put above the guy who was in charge of deportation, and he reversed about 2,000. I think it might have been more. He reversed a lot of deportation of German immigrants who had no, if there was nothing in their record about advocating violence or engaging in violence, then he said that we should not deport them. And that was a great concern, because we were moving up to World War I, and the handwriting was on the wall that there was a good chance we would be in that. And so I can see a lot of tension with that. But yeah, it was like, okay, you have people who are here because they're hostile to America. And again, there's reasons for that. I mean, I look at what we have done to the oil-bearing countries, to the oil-bearing Muslim countries, and I have trouble, faulting them for their terroristic approach to dealing with it, because they don't have many other options. But at the same time, it's, the job of our government is to protect us, and so that's a legitimate concern. I think it's
right.
being held, it's being dealt with in a heavy-handed, not particularly competent way. But it's plausible that to say, you know, you can't come here from a country we're at war with. That's
Well, let me make your point, support what you're saying. I mean, after 9/11, on 9/11, I had an office near where I have one now in Millburn, New Jersey, and I went and I climbed up the South Mountain Reservation to a point where I could look out and see the smoke from the towers. And I have never been that much of a flag waver, but I was. This is a little bit moot, but I was kind of ready to join up with the military. I mean, because this was, I guess, less than 20 miles away from where I was, and I felt like we were attacked. Well, I mean, that was not brilliant. So we had been attacked. So I understand that, and the need to sort of protect ourselves. But yeah, I mean, the other thing is, as that has receded in the past, I mean, my clients tend to be from all over the world. In the beginning, when I started my practice, they were predominantly Latinos. And probably that's why I became an immigration lawyer, because I had worked in Mexico City on a film as a lowly production assistant and got along with Latinos. And, but over the years, it's been people from all over. And I mean, you have a system, like you say, it's heavy-handed, so you can have an Irish woman who's like 87 years old, and she's being, sort of hassled as if she is, an Al-Qaeda operative. I mean, I don't know that happens so much today, but once a bureaucracy gets a going, you can, heavy-handed is kind of what you get. So I understand about, but on the point of assimilation, I had another thought, which is this is on my end of this conversation. It's Steve stumbles. What has he stumbled on lately? So YouTube, I found, which I highly recommend to all of you out there in the listening and watching audience, a YouTube of a TED Talk by a musician named Daryl Davis, who makes the point, I think, rather eloquently. It's worth watching. It's a good storytelling. That this type of xenophobia that's based on identity is, obviously based on a kind of fear, and he makes the point that fear, ignorance breeds fear. So the story he tells is, he starts off the talk telling how he kind of made the acquaintance of a guy who was in jail and was released. Daryl Davis is a black man. This was an ex-policeman who was white in Indiana. And he opens this cabinet at the back of the TED Talk stage, and he pulls out this beautiful green sort of satin robe. And he says, I made the acquaintance and kind of befriended this guy. This is his robe. He was the head of the Ku Klux Klan in Indiana. And we had contact, and he left the Klan and he gave me his robe. So he hangs that up there. If you look on YouTube or Google, you search for why I, as a black man, attend KKK rallies.
Oh, is he the guy that got like 200 Klansmen to leave the Klan?
Well, I don't know if he did that, but what he did, the other part of the story is he talks about how he arranged a meeting with the national, the grand whatever wizard, whatever they call him, the head of the Ku Klux Klan. The guy didn't know from his name that he was black, and they meet in this guy's motel room. Guy has a bodyguard with a gun, and they're sitting and they're kind of sizing each other's up. Daryl Davis did this because as the young black kid leading a Boy Scout parade, people threw rocks at him, the white sort of crowds, and he had never encountered this. And his reaction was, he just could not accept. Why would somebody hate me if they don't even know me? So he had something in him he was able to contact this guy. They were sitting in a motel room, and there was a noise in the room that sounded like gunfire. And both of them tensed up and were ready to, you know, just like kill each other. And it turned out it was a bucket of soda cans, and the ice had just melted, and they cascaded and made this noise. And both of them, when they realized what happened, they started laughing. Over the years, he ended up inviting this Klansman to barbecues and stuff. And then at the end of the talk, which I've now ruined for you, he opens this cabinet and he takes out another robe. And it's like, this is his robe. He turned the guy. He left the Klan. So he makes the point that you know, in that moment where they were ready to kill each other for something stupid, they didn't, ignorance, he says, causes fear, feeds fear. And then if not checked, leads to hatred. And, you know, I think he's right about that. You know, so I think that there's something there. I mean, you know, things are often not binary. I wanted to avoid the word black and white. So with George and Chinese immigration, he will have seen, I think one thing from reading like his writing about this, that he must have encountered, and it's kind of implicit in his writings, it's not just difference of customs and difference of, you know, racial appearance, but I think also, and he writes about this actually, a kind of insularity and standoffishness and sort of pride, which, you know, very much goes to non-assimilation. The Chinese people, he makes this point, you know, in various levels. You know, the Chinese civilization was well developed when, you know, white, like European civilization was still in the barbarian stage. And I think part of what he's reacting to in this anti-Chinese feeling that he has is related to the fact that the Chinese community that he must have had contact with, whatever else you could say about it, regarded itself as superior. So I think some of what he's reacting to is they don't want to mingle with us and they think they're better than us. But again, I'm taking my cue from Darrell Davis. My takeaway from that TED talk is, you know, the other thing is, if George had lived longer, he would have seen and experienced the sort of melting pot in a way that had not really happened yet in his day. I mean, I'm an ex-New Yorker. Maybe it's like alcoholism. You never like recover. So I guess I'm a New Yorker. And, you know, one of the things that you kind of like if you're a New Yorker and you get fond of is that it's very multicultural. You can go out for Chinese food, you can go out for Japanese food, you can mingle with people from different races, and they have assimilated. You know, there's a lot of assimilation that George was saying that's not going to happen. So we have a lot of Chinese now in our country, and what he pointed to as a fear has not happened with Chinese people settling in the U.S.
Well,
so
yeah, I want to
yeah,
push back on that a little bit, because I was studying coolie labor, looking for a lot of documents on it, and got some from the Chinese embassy of the 1880s, and there's some, even Wikipedia has that the word coolie, Li is a worker. That's why there's so many Chinese people named Li. Li just means worker. And KU is it's still anglicized because they didn't use our alphabet, but KU meant oppressively hard, and the coolie caste was the slave caste. They were the bottom caste above the untouchables. Both, it's the same word in India and China, as coolie labor is like basically slave labor. And when I talked to somebody else, somebody started talking about how racist Terence Powderly was, because he described these coolie laborers living 9 and 10 to a room in total filth and stuff. But if American slaves, if slaves in the South were living in those conditions, we would not consider that to be a racist statement about the slaves. We would consider that to be a statement about the masters. And what happened with Chinese immigration is that the overwhelming majority of Chinese people that came here were either coolie laborers or coolie masters, or businessmen who used coolie labor. So there's that old joke about somebody reaching into the pocket of his clothes that came back from the laundry, and he reads a little ticket that says, "Help, I'm a prisoner in a Chinese laundry." And the only reason that couldn't happen is that coolies were not allowed to learn or to speak English. They were not allowed to have conversations with anyone other than their masters. And they were not allowed to read and write even in Chinese, and even in China. So they were effectively brought here as slaves. And it was very, very difficult to crack that because they had relatives back in China who would be punished if they escaped. So we were up against a very difficult system. And the one document
thank you for pointing this out, by the way. This is helpful to me. Go ahead. Sorry. Yeah.
The document that captures most of this, James McGuire, Georgists have this expression, have you seen the cat? Once you've seen the cat, you can't unsee it. It's like, now that you understand the relationship of land monopoly to everything, you see it everywhere. And James McGuire was the person who coined that expression. But if you look in savingcommunities.org/docs and scroll down to James McGuire, he has a speech on the Chinese exclusion. And he basically went through all the steps. He said people from New York are talking about this like it's just racism. And what people don't understand is that it's the New York corporations that are profiting from this slave labor. It's the railroads and stuff that are using slave labor so they don't have to pay American workers a decent wage. And the assimilation was made difficult by the Chinese, by the masters of these slaves. And there were 6 companies that were like Chinese tongs almost. They were half corporation, half gang, and they were basically preventing any kind of reforms. They couldn't get the Chinese to read and write. So this I don't think was in McGuire's thing, but there were attempts to require the Chinese immigrants had to learn to read and write in English in order to stay here. And that got struck down. And it just everything that they tried to do to help the Chinese coolie escape his slave status was beaten down by the same people who were calling the Californians racist for wanting to curb it. In Peru, there were islands off Peru that used coolie labor, and they died. They lived about 7 or 8 years, and then they just died, and they shipped new ones. But they were mining phosphorus. They were mining bird guano off of these islands, and the phosphorus dust was just so deadly that they would just routinely die, and they would send for new ones. So yeah, it was a very different thing. And I always say to people, nobody ever accused us of being racist for putting an end to the African slave trade. In 1808 we said we're not importing any more African slaves. Well, that's not racist. That's putting an end to slavery.
Well, so one thing, I'm grateful to you for bringing this up. I was not aware of it. I mean, I was aware of James McGuire, but I hadn't read his stuff and I didn't know this level of detail. I mean, it sounds like, at a minimum, an ugly situation, this sort of gang-like importation by Chinese, in a way, of Chinese, kind of slaves. All right, so that's helpful to me. And the reason it's helpful to me is that when I sort of, in my stumbling around in archival research last fall, when I sort of went down the rabbit hole of reading, some of the more detailed things that George said about Chinese immigration, as a long-standing admirer of George on the one hand, and a sort of, at this point, veteran immigration lawyer, these things had kind of dovetailed for me until that point. So reading that, it was like that hit me hard, and it was hard for me to grapple with it. And it's helpful me to know the historical fact that it's not exactly the way it would be today, where a lot, just about all of the immigration that I deal with and the people that come to my office, and sometimes I have to defend people against deportation. We're not talking about that kind of thing for the most part. And when we are talking about it, it's not like a systemic gang-like, slavery situation that I've lived and dealt with. So it's helpful to know that the context is different. However, I want to just say, it doesn't help me. I mean, there are other things that do help me with this, but one thing that remains troubling to me about Henry George's, attitude about this. And again, I think the world is vastly better off for the insights that he had, is that he still retains, I think, an element in his attitude towards this, as much as we can see it, of bias that, at least according to his writings, goes a bit beyond this. I mean, I'll read you just, in that 1869 Trib article, he says, in person, the Chinese are generally apparently cleanly, but filthy in their habits. Their quarters reek with noisome odors and are fit breeding places for pestilence. We can come back to that with COVID-19 if you like. But he says the administration of justice among them is attended with great difficulty. No plan for making them tell the truth seems to be effective. They are as cruel as they are cowardly. Lying and stealing is... All right, so all that. Now, some of that, again, back to your context, in the situation that they were in, it was a corrupt thing, even beyond the individual workers. Okay, so I appreciate that. But there was a double standard a little bit in what George was doing, because in like a standard article that he wrote in August 18th, 1888, he takes the side of immigrants, but a different set of immigrants, and argues with all of his usual eloquence against the charges that have been brought against Italians, Irish, Hungarians, and Poles, accusing them of the same thing. They're dirty. They work cheaply. They won't learn our customs. They won't get our political situation. And he says basically nonsense. They'll get it. They're fine. They'll assimilate. And so the same grounds that he uses to sort of castigate the Chinese and to some extent Africans, those same exact grounds he defends Europeans. And between that and his, I'll read you one thing and then I'll stop my spiel here. He says in a letter in 1893 to William Lloyd Garrison, his colleague, he says, "Is there no such thing as family, nation, race?" At some point, I want to read you Garrison's reply, which I dug out from archives because it's really interesting and expresses the feeling I have about it, and it gets me towards sort of dealing with this. So Garrison, and this was all triggered, by the way, by your James McGuire's thing that you've put me onto. So they were talking about McGuire. McGuire had been argued in the Senate, I guess, in favor of extending the Chinese Exclusion Act and requiring registration and reversing the usual presumption that a Chinese person found in the US would be presumed to be here illegally, which had never happened before with other clients. All right, so now we understand more about it. But anyway, so this is what Garrison writes. My dear Mr. George, your kind letter of November 30th was duly received, and I have read with interest, although not with approval, your enclosed article on the Chinese. I think you missed the point of my controversy with Judge McGuire, because Garrison had really criticized him. It is not a difference of opinion, but a question of human rights. As president of the Chinese Defense League of Massachusetts, I have 1,200 clients to defend, to say nothing of the duty I owe to every downtrodden man or woman. Our Defense League is a reproduction of the old Vigilance Committee, which in anti-slavery times watched the kidnappers in pursuit of their prey and made Boston a hot place for them to visit. Garrison's father, William Lloyd Garrison Sr., was a very leading abolitionist. You'll remember, he says, that Daniel Webster, like Judge McGuire, defended the iniquity, and the leading ministers, lawyers, and merchants, many of them our best and most respected citizens, sided against the slave. Nevertheless, the unsparing, deserved denunciations with which the abolitionists treated their apostasy to freedom was essential, and today their descendants are ashamed to reproduce their record. Before such an outrage on humanity as this, meaning what McGuire was arguing for, every weapon except that of untruth is justifiable. It is not a question of the Chinese alone. A friend of mine from the Pacific Coast, who was my guest last week, is equally bitter in denunciations of the Japanese. In other quarters, the same expression is made regarding the Russian Jews, and when I circulate petitions for the abolition of the disgraceful Chinese laws, the refusal to sign is frequently coupled with the wish that, quote, every damned Irishman in the country could be exported too, unquote. It is not an assault on race lines only. It resolves itself into an attack on humanity. Is there no such thing as family, nation, race, you ask? I reply in the immortal words of Fenelon, I love my family better than myself. I love my country better than my family. I love the human race better than my country. You put the pyramid upon its apex, and your inquiry should have commenced with self instead of family. My parallel was not between slavery and the shutting out of Chinese immigration, although I am convinced the same spirit covers both, but it was between the Fugitive Slave Law and the Geary Act. In reply to your question regarding the Negroes, should I consider it a wise thing to permit them to come under present circumstances, I reply it would be a just thing, and justice is always wisdom. The poorest and most degraded savage I would welcome with open arms to this country of opportunity, and if our Christian civilization and advantages cannot stand the test, we cannot too quickly let some better and more fitting race succeed. You minimize the probability of dissension in the single tax ranks. Already it is cropping out. The men and women who were drawn to your great truth by its universality and its brotherly love for all mankind are beginning to measure such professions with the defense of such a flagrant contradiction as the Geary Act. This very morning I have received a request from a single tax paper to give utterance to my views on Judge McGuire's speech, and I have no hesitation in saying that the majority of single taxers outside of California will be a unit in this regard. I deprecate as much as you can any distraction from the point we are so united in urging, but it would be treason to liberty to be dumb on such an issue as this, which is as fundamental and comprehensive as the single tax itself. But I have said enough, and again beg you to see the distinction between abstract differences of opinion and concrete attacks on individual rights. I could pity a Southerner who felt it right to buy and sell human beings, really. But when he invaded my neighborhood to snatch back to slavery my friend and neighbor, he invaded my household as well, and manhood would be lacking in me to not to vigorously characterize and repel him. I question whether either you or Judge McGuire ever put yourself in the place of the poor Chinaman and looked at the matter through his eyes, forgetting all theories about race and civilization. Faithfully
Well,
yours, W.L. Garrison. So,
McGuire clearly did, and in his speech he talks about the situation
well, I guess
for the
Garrison didn't
Chinaman.
think so.
But well,
Yeah.
but Garrison, I mean, Garrison's saying it's not a dispute over fact, but there are some facts that Garrison presumes that are not at all what McGuire claims. The analogy between a Chinese person coming to California and a fugitive slave coming to Massachusetts, well, the fugitive slave went to Massachusetts to escape slavery, and the Chinaman in California was brought to California as a slave. And
well, I mean, we have to give some credit to Garrison for knowledge of the Chinese community, since he's the head of a Chinese Defense League of 1,200 Chinese people. So he's probably aware of something to do with Chinese immigration. I think a lot of it comes down.
Well, it's a Chinese Defense League of 1,200 people, but is it a Defense League of 1,200 Chinese people, or is it a Defense League of 1,200 basically East Coast liberals who have decided to champion this cause? I don't know that there were 1,200 Chinese people in Massachusetts.
He says I have 1,200 clients to defend, and he's obviously he was active in representing Chinese people.
I mean, my
think
question is how, if McGuire is right in general, and it seems to be, the view from other documents I've seen, it seems to be a general, I don't want to say consensus, but it seems to be a strong majority view that these Chinese coolies were here as slaves and were not available to be liberated the way Garrison is describing.
Well, my interest is more in George than McGuire. I mean, it's all important background to the exchange between George and Garrison. But, what remains disturbing to me is that George repeatedly uses the word, albeit before the modern era, race. I mean, he's explicit in finding one element of non-assimilability to be race. He didn't foresee that we would become more of a racially diverse and multicultural society without the catastrophe. Now, you could say it made sense for him to think it would be catastrophe, because even after the Civil War, there was a lot of, to say the least, tension between blacks and whites in the South. And there were, as you point out, there were reasons to really be concerned about Chinese communities in the U.S. But, I mean, he uses the language of, identity-based sort of bias that he does not have with Europeans. And I am disturbed by that, okay?
I'm just saying the situation is not the same for Europeans. And,
What was that? I heard a voice.
Yes, and I said we have some questions, and we are at 3:14.
Okay.
Yeah, and I have to cut out at 3:30. So.
Oh yeah,
Okay.
Nick Tiedemann has his hand up in chat.
Okay.
Well, let me get the ones that are in Q&A.
Well, but Nick has been over here, and you are liable to forget it. That's why.
Well, yeah. Can Nick use the Q&A? Is that? Well, there's several from Mark. I don't know that I'm going to go through all of them, but Max Hirsch wrote "Democracy versus Socialism." He's an Austrian Georgist economist. He argued that single tax in one country combined with open immigration would be the best way to share economic rent and raise wages globally. In other words, when America was accepting big waves of immigration, Henry George said that raised wages in Europe too.
Right.
Does this not suggest that the single tax plus open borders is the the consistent Georgist immigration policy.
Yeah, I mean, I think that question gets at what I think that helps me sort of reconcile these two elements here, which is that, I mean, George is the Henry George that we know and follow and admire because of his incredible insights about poverty, the causes of poverty, how to alleviate that, and really in his writings, he presents it as a human, as a global problem. His sympathies, when he writes about even the history of China and India, as with Ireland, is with the victims of land monopoly. So, you know, and I think he would agree that I think Mark is right. You know, the point is that the real fundamental problem is to alleviate those things globally. And my take as an immigration lawyer is, you know, it's an economic opportunity differential is the biggest driver of migration. And we are, to some extent, all connected as trading countries beyond national borders. So poverty that happens in one part of the world, I mean, I think we're kind of past the point where it doesn't affect us in a given country. And what's really needed is a global application of George's ideas. And I think that's consistent with a lot of the spirit and the content of George's writings, in spite of this kind of weird thing, which may be somewhat a factor of history and somewhat a factor of background.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's my comment.
Can you describe, Alan Ridley says, can you describe the greatest common sense immigration policy for today, one that might heal the wounds inflicted by Trump and at the same time allay the fears of those who support recent policy?
Incredibly enough, I feel, not to be a wise guy, but I feel like I can. I'm surprising myself. Yeah, it's adopting George's ideas on the single tax. Next question.
Okay. I just wanted to mention, because you had said earlier that Obama was pretty rough on immigration.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
26 years, who was in charge back when I'm trying to...
I think Clinton was around. Yeah, probably Clinton, because, and here's an irony, another demonstration of our ambivalence at best, our grudging attitude towards give us you're tired, you're poor, under Clinton. So around 1995, 96 was the Oklahoma City bombing. And in the immediate aftermath of that, in that faraway world, this country in the 90s, it was assumed that foreigners did the deed. Turns out it was two good old American boys, Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols. But even so, Congress and under Clinton, they were all for it. They passed some really kind of harsh changes to immigration law. And so it's just another demonstration. So, even under Clinton, and I think whenever the economy has had hard times, so under Bush, and continuing, oddly enough, under Obama, I think that kind of drives things towards making it more difficult to come here legally and get a green card and live here. So, yeah, it's not just Trump, although, I mean, Trump's overlay on that in his administration has been to sort of continue a pre-existing trend to and really to make the what we call the processing climate, the administrative climate, ever more hostile, where you have a breakdown of consistency and a willingness to follow pro-immigration policies that are in the law. We could do an hour on that, though, Dan. I mean,
Nick Tiedemann wrote, in my view, it is possible to share the rent from natural opportunities globally among all nations that allow their citizens to leave, and that justice requires us to allow anyone in who wishes to come.
Right on.
Yeah. I mean, there are people who I can, like, your right to travel is provides you haven't been violating other people's rights. That's what being arrested is you lose your right to travel because you have violated the rights of others.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if, I don't know if a person who has committed a crime in his own country, and we don't want to let him in here, but he's already served his time in that country, and if he's already served what would have been his time in our country.
There are a lot of penalties and restrictions on whether you can be or stay here if you have been guilty of almost any level of significant crime anywhere in the world. There are exceptions, but they are not automatic. I've handled some cases like that, and by and large, if you've committed even some things that are fairly minor that for normal like U.S. citizen life you get expunged, that would be taken off your record, that can keep you from getting a green card and get you deported. So, and it doesn't matter whether you've been convicted here or elsewhere. That's been
as far as sharing the rent globally, I've always had logistical problems with that because, for example, the total land, at one point, the total land rent of Japan was 4 times the total land rent of the United States, and their high land rent came from extreme crowding. So I couldn't see justice in the Japanese having to share their higher per capita rent with us. So I think that was Nick's other point, and I think there's some logistical problems with separating what is the rent of natural opportunities basically from what is the rent of the high rent that's due to scarcity of natural opportunities, which is Japan's situation.
To say nothing of national sovereignty and political, alliances and hostilities between countries. But
I always said if you have to have open immigration to people from a hostile country, France had to have open immigration. Could the Germans just leave their guns behind and immigrate to France until they were a majority, and then have their guns sent? It's.
one other point I wanted to squeeze in here, as time is short, is I think another theme that I thought was helpful to me was this idea that kind of racist sort of agenda, whether on immigration or not, is a diversion. This, as George said, a diversion, or can be used as a diversion from the more fundamental question of sort of equal rights to the use of the earth. It's a good divider, and sort of distracts our attention, as George pointed out, from that kind of thing. There's another good YouTube I stumbled on. If you Google, I don't know, there's a guy named Brandon Ugbunu. No, it's not Google. It's Radiolab, an episode called The Liberation of RNA, where he talks about how he has dealt with, because he's a bioresearcher, the racism of James Watson, of Watson and Crick, one of the co-discoverers of DNA. And Ogbuno is a black man and has taught in universities. He's a professor. And one way he gets past this is that he says what we really need to do is to focus on what's important. And to me, there's so much in George, virtually everything he wrote and all his major works, that's what's important. And it helps me, even in the politically divided landscape we have now, where I can get angry, it helps rescue me from that, to read George, because it gets me into what I call George space, or maybe I could call it the zone, where you're dealing not with left versus right polarization, but you feel like you've sort of broken above the clouds and you're taking the longer view, and it's that kind of thing that has helped me kind of deal with some of these issues. As a little surprised to say, Dan, I hope that's not insulting, but you've helped me as well. How's that for a left-handed compliment? And with my foot in my mouth.
I take what I can get.
All right, fine.
Yeah, Ed made this analogy in other sessions that for landless people, it's like being a sharecropper, whether you're technically getting a share of the crop or not, and that most immigrants are not like sharecroppers. Or most immigrants are in that sharecropper position. Mark again, might the difficulty of any ethnic group to assimilate into a new culture be as much of a sign of the flaw in the new culture that cannot adapt and change to allow the people in? Why is the burden of adaptation placed on the immigrant and not the culture that got here first?
Well, that sounds like a segue to like a whole other session. I mean, that's
I just sum it up with the thing, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. I mean, why did you go there first in the first place if you don't like the culture?
Well, I will say, again, this is not scientific, but my sampling of, immigration through my client base of individuals, by far the dominant view, again, I think mostly of my Latino clients, but just about everybody, they are eager to become American. I mean, they want nothing but. But that's not a scientific poll. That's just my clients. Since I have to cut out, I wonder if I could give Henry George the last word in a stirring thing that's just like inspiring. Or you could say no, Dan, because I feel like I've been hogging the screen time. But let me just say, at the end of Social Problems, his concluding chapter, this is how he ends it. He says, I am firmly convinced that to effect any great social improvement, it is sympathy rather than self-interest, the sense of duty rather than the desire for self-advancement that must be appealed to. And as man is so constituted that it is utterly impossible for him to attain happiness, save by seeking the happiness of others, so does it seem to be of the nature of things that individuals and classes can obtain their own just rights only by struggling for the rights of others. To illustrate, no combination of workmen can raise their wages much above the level of ordinary wages. The attempt to do so is like the attempt to bail out a boat without stopping up the seams. For this reason, it is necessary, if workmen would accomplish anything real and permanent for themselves, not merely that each trade should seek the common interests of all trades, but that skilled workmen should address themselves to those general measures which will improve the condition of unskilled workmen. Those who are most to be considered, those for whose help the struggle must be made, if labor is to be enfranchised and social justice won, are those least able to help or struggle for themselves, those who have no advantage of property or skill or intelligence, the men and women who are at the very bottom of the social scale. In securing the equal rights of these, we shall secure the equal rights of all. Hence it is, as Mazzini said, that it is around the standard of duty rather than around the standard of self-interest that men must rally to win the rights of man. And herein may we see the deep philosophy of him who bade men love their neighbors as themselves. In that spirit, and in no other, is the power to solve social problems and carry civilization onward. So, okay, that's what I got.
Okay, well, it's as good a time to wrap it up as any.
Yeah, give Henry the last word.
Okay, thank you.
So I'm happy thank you. Good talk.
Yeah, thank you. And we'll see you at the next conference if we do a live conference. And
okay, happy to be back if you could stand it.
Yeah, we want you back.
I'm looking at chat, and I got a couple people who are saying that they liked it quite a bit. So
good. And the other people didn't say anything. So.
Well, they're not toward the end. I haven't read all the chat.
No, there's nothing at the beginning. So
okay.
Yeah.
Well, I'm tempted to say I'm just going to go out for some Chinese food. I'll see you later.
Okay.
Okay. Take it easy.
All right, will do.
Bye.
Bye.